and on the Zoom. We're particularly grateful to see so many elected officials in the room here tonight. We have Mark Laredo, the current president of the City Council, Susan Albright, the former president and still a city councilor, and city councilors Allison Leary, Rick Lipoff, Bill Humphrey, Andrea Kelly, and Andrea Downs. And also Emily Prenner is here from the school committee. So thanks you guys in particular for coming out. In case you're not familiar with us, we here at Newton for Everyone are a pro-housing organization. We are advocating for diverse housing opportunities for people of all ages, means, and backgrounds to be able to live here in Newton. Also, a quick technical legal item, we are recording the presentation. We'll be posting it up on our YouTube page later, and state law obliges me to tell you that. If you're not comfortable, unfortunately, you will have to leave. So yeah, what are we doing here tonight? We are going to be hearing about the link between housing development and the budget that cities like Newton can make available for their schools. Because we are a housing advocacy organization, we did not take a position on the strike or the details of the contract that was being worked out last year and into the winter. However, we, like so many other people here in Newton, were distressed by the conflict between our teachers, who are such a core part of our community and the backbone of our treasured schools, and the city, which faces real fiscal constraints and must balance its budget every year. My older daughter will be starting kindergarten at Horseman in the fall, and so I, like so many others in the room tonight, feel a deep personal connection to our school system, and I really wanted to continue to provide the kind of first-class education that has drawn so many people to our city. And so while the tension in the fall and winter was not exclusively about money, money was a major concern. And so we wanted to help Newton and other similar cities understand what options may be available to them to increase flexibility in their budgets beyond simply raising taxes. And fortunately, we have the perfect guests here with us tonight to discuss this. Elise Rapoza is MassINC's Senior Research Associate and has studied the fiscal impacts of housing here in Massachusetts. She is the author of New Housing Production in Massachusetts, Fiscal Dynamics and Community Implications. And we also have Luc Shuster, who's the Executive Director of Boston Indicators, which provides data-driven insights to support policymakers, community leaders, and advocates in their efforts to make Greater Boston a more thriving, equitable, and inclusive region. So we're going to start out by hearing from Elise about her research and what the data shows that development of housing can do for municipal budgets. Then Luc will share his perspective on the presentation, and we'll save some time at the end for questions from the audience, both here and on the Zoom. If you are on the Zoom, please type your questions into the chat, and we'll try to read them out as we go along in the Q&A. So that's all from me. Elise, please take it away.
I'm sorry, I forgot about which one was the on. Oh, there you go. Great. All right, hello everybody. All right, so my name is Elise Rapoza, as he explained. I currently work at MassINC, which it's Massachusetts Institute for a New Commonwealth. Some people put capital I, low NC. It's not Massachusetts Incorporated. Personal pet peeve for all the journalists in the audience. Not everything's showing, but I'm not sure what happened with this slide. But for cities and towns across Massachusetts, education makes up by far the largest percentage of the budget. It's nearly half. This is every city and town, how much they spend by category, all added up for the past fiscal year. And education makes up 47% of the budget. And as you all, I'm sure a lot of you in the audience live here in Newton, but this is also happening across the state, where education has really put a strain on budgets because it's gotten a lot more expensive. This is largely due to inflation and a quirk in the way the state reimburses communities for their education expenses that doesn't fully account for inflation when it exceeds a certain percentage. But yet municipalities are asked to do more and more. We have to make up for learning losses due to COVID, we address mental health crises, and so where's that money going to come from? Luckily, there are multiple ways that the state and cities and towns can look at increasing revenue. There is multiple sources of state aid and incentives for cities and towns. There's the tax base, whether that be residential property values, excise taxes, commercial property values, meals and lodging taxes by stimulating your local businesses. And currently being considered is a property transfer tax that would allow you, communities to place a small tax on the sale of homes over $1 million. I just looked online. I think that applies to probably most of your homes here in Newton. With those funds being directed towards the creation of affordable housing. Interestingly, even though the population in Massachusetts has grown by 4%, enrollment has declined by 4%. I could theorize about the reasons why people are having fewer kids or aging population. Don't have those numbers in front of me at this moment, but this also relates to some other work that's been done by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and myself as part of this study, showing that, in fact, adding new housing does not necessarily mean that you're going to end up with more kids in your schools. But anyway, so you can grow your tax base without adding new students is what I'm getting to there. That said, we wanted to know, we took a retrospective and looked, does the additional revenue you get from building more housing actually offset the costs of educating the students that live in that housing? And so in my previous role, I was the Senior Research Associate for the Public Policy Center at UMass Dartmouth with Michael Goodman. Actually, Michael, I don't know if any of you know Michael Goodman. He grew up here in Newton and now lives in my home city of New Bedford, a lot cheaper. And this study was supported in part by the Massachusetts, MHP, the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. So I'm going to focus here on the local impacts. We also looked at the state impacts. So we took a representative sample of housing that was built between 2014 and 2016. I'd have to warn you, this research was released in 2018, so that's why everything's very old. But all the findings would still apply today, if not more so. And then we calculated the property and excise tax revenue associated with that new housing by looking at the value, the increased value of the increased assessed values on those parcels and the average number of cars that would be owned by households in those units. And then we subtracted the costs of providing an education for those students as would be calculated using the Chapter 70 formula, and also subtracting off how much state aid you would get under Chapter 70, and then adding on, we're very conservative in all our calculations. We never made assumptions that would kind of make the data look better than it is. In fact, we did the opposite. And so we actually added on additional costs if communities had a history of spending more than they necessarily had to. And then here's a map of the sample. It's a mix of market rate, affordable, and mixed income located throughout the state. There's slightly more market rate than was built across over that time period. And so we weighted the affordable units slightly more in our calculations to adjust for that fact. And then, like I said, we added in the municipal revenue from property taxes and excise taxes. What we did not add is that new housing produces additional income for municipalities in terms of induced economic activity in the area. That we added, we showed as a benefit to the state, but we did not, it's much more difficult to do that for municipalities because it's so varied depending on what sorts of economic activities take place in that community. So the models aren't necessarily good at that. So there's all sorts of benefits that, like I said, all of our calculations are conservative and might show things to probably have less of a positive impact than they actually do. Local student costs, so this is I love bragging about this because this never happens. We had 100% response rate to a survey of of all superintendents at where those housing developments were built. It helps that we got the Commissioner of Education to tell the superintendents they had to respond. And so we didn't get any like personal identifiable information, but what we did get is the demographics that would be used to calculate their Chapter 70 required contributions, as well as the aid that they would get following that same formula. And that we found there was a wide range in costs using that approach, ranging anywhere from around $6,000 to almost $13,000 per student. On the high end are those students with special needs. Anyway. Sorry, the next part gets into the state costs, but I'm just going to focus on the municipal for these purposes. All right, so then what is the net impact? When you look at the total revenues from property taxes and excise taxes, and you subtract off the expenses associated with education, in the aggregate, we find that new housing has a fiscal benefit for cities and towns. So that looking at adding all the data together and all the housing developments, mix them all in the same bucket, each new unit of housing produces an average of $1,273 in net new revenue. This is in 2018 dollars. So inflating that up to 2024 dollars, it's more like $1,610 per new unit. And this is weighted to affect the balance of income restricted to non-income restricted. That is not to say that every single housing development is going to be a winner financially for your community. Occasionally, a housing development can present a cost. It's not that cost that doesn't necessarily persist forever. It's very much reflective of the demographics of the population and whether there's a large number, like an above average number of special needs students in that housing development, unfortunately. And what we found is that those costs offset 26% of the gains, but there's still a substantial upside of that 74%. Oh, yeah, I don't know what happened. It was labeled, I promise. So I will explain it to you. That the red, of course, is the bad, and those are the losses. The light green are the positive to the municipality, and the dark green is the positive to the state. You can see that the state gets a lot more wings when you build new housing than the community does. But there are ways that money can be redirected to communities. Some of it already is, but there's more that could be done. No, so that 1,600 was already the net. That was the aggregate. So like on average across the whole population, including the winners and the losers. Yeah, so occasionally, like that average includes some that lost money and some that gained money, and the losses accounted for 26% of the gains. That's annual, yep. All right, that said, there's a lot of ways, sources of funds for communities to offset education expenses that were not included in the model. So that red line, we can actually make a lot smaller if you take advantage of these resources. The two on the bottom, most communities are already taking advantage of. One is the circuit breaker, and that is a reimbursement for very high special education services. So that has increased somewhat as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, but it's not completely where it needs to be to cover all those costs. But that does reduce that red bar I was showing you on the previous slide. In addition, there's federal entitlement grants. There's including Title I and Individuals with Disabilities Education grants. Both of those increase with the number of students in those categories that you have in your schools. And then finally, there's 40R and 40S. This is something you have to actively decide to do as a community, but it's like a guarantee insurance policy. So if you're zoning for new housing, if you create a smart growth district under 40R, you'll get money up front for planning for that. You'll get money for each unit of housing that's built, and that's the 40R part. And then the 40S part is if you're in that unlucky 25, like that unlucky group of communities that did experience losses, it'll cover 100% of that, the net difference after accounting for the revenue. So they look at how much you're getting in property taxes, how much you're getting in Chapter 78. If you're still seeing negatives, they'll cover that difference.
We looked at 40R in the city of Newton, and one of the things I heard was that the state legislature isn't always fully funding the 40R program.
I've heard, so she's asking if they're always fully funding the 40R program. I've heard that a lot. I keep asking that question of people who should know. And I guess they are, it's just, it gets appropriated as needed. So it's not like they get a bunch of money, it's more like they get money as they need the money. And what, this is the really interesting part, is almost nobody gets 40S because almost nobody needs 40S. So after taking advantage of all these sources of funds to cover those increased education costs, pretty much no one qualifies. But there's also a cost of doing nothing, right? So what happens if you don't do something about high housing costs and the lack of supply of housing? So what we find is that there's strong negative impacts on communities of high housing costs. The impact where people and businesses decide to live. It affects new business formation and success rates. It offsets discretionary spending, which negatively impacts both small businesses and your personal quality of life. It makes your workers less productive because they're stressed out all the time. And it can displace your local workforce, which can have practical impacts on the functioning of essential community services. I don't know if you all just heard the radio program about firefighters. I think it was on the Cape, living like miles and miles away. That sounds terrifying. And yeah, so in sum, usually, like 75% of the time, your housing is a net benefit and can help pad your municipal budgets. Occasionally, that's not the case, but there are state resources that you can take advantage to deal with that, especially if you plan ahead.
If I press, or are you going to turn that off? Cool. Awesome. Elise, great teeing up for this conversation. I have, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes of comments kind of reacting, and then I'll ask you some questions. Yeah, is that good? So just again, like Luke said, I'm Luc Shuster, Executive Director of Boston Indicators. We're a research center think tank housed at the Boston Foundation. We do a really wide range of research beyond just housing, but over the last several years, as the housing crisis across Greater Boston has become more and more pressing, we've just been doing more research on the issue. And one plug, actually, we're doing a new bi-weekly newsletter project that's tracking local debates around implementing the MBTA community's upzoning law. That's called Upzone Update, really being led by Amy Dane, who's a Newton resident, who many of you I hope know, does fantastic work, a real zoning expert. So if anybody's interested in tracking the conversation across the region around MBTA communities specifically, if you Google Boston Indicators and Upzone Update, you'll find that, I bet, and can subscribe there. So I wanted to make 3 points kind of building off of Elise and also just connecting it to some other themes. Start with I think a really important caveat for these discussions, and then the other 2 points are sort of 2 lanes of cases to make for why new housing can be so positive for our communities. One is more X's and O's and research-based, and the other is about values and thinking about the kinds of communities that we want to be building in our backyards. So let me start with the caveat. People are far more small c conservative, even in a progressive region like ours, than I think we give people credit for. I think there's just something about, I don't know, maybe it's human nature, that change can be scary. And I think any new housing development understandably can trigger some of those fears and hesitance around change. I live in Somerville. The house directly across the street from me just got torn down 2 years ago. Slow process of rebuilding. It's mostly been redone, but the landscaping still hasn't been finished. And it's been a huge pain in the ass for our family. So construction, just the fact of changing the built environment really is an annoyance, and that's just, I think, real, and we need to be willing to be upfront about. The other one's traffic and parking. Again, most new housing development brings with it new cars, and that is a nuisance for people who've lived in a community for a long time. Now on traffic, I don't want to get us too far into debates around the particulars around parking requirements in new housing, but there obviously are ways to do new housing that attract more or less new cars and new traffic, and that's a really important part of the conversation. But I do think in broad strokes, more people often, at least in the near term, does lead to more cars, and that's another consideration. So I think it's important for proponents to keep those in mind as you are talking to folks who might be more skeptical about new housing. So let me get into the research-based case for new housing, and this is really riffing off of Elise's work and then some other national research on these issues. My sense is that the research base is really clear that in high-cost, high-demand regions like Greater Boston, cities and towns like Newton, where I live in Somerville, the economic case for new housing is kind of a slam dunk. They lead to all sorts of revitalization of downtowns, bringing new customers to local businesses. Net new housing construction, when it's done at large enough a scale, absolutely helps reduce housing costs for other people who want to live there. It allows young families to consider living in the homes that in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. I've seen evidence that one of the reasons we have declining birth rates in the United States is because the cost of living has gotten so high that young families are delaying their first child and ultimately having fewer children than they otherwise would. So these are all really important to keep in mind. Actually, if it's easy, can we pull up one of Elise's slides? Because I want to check that I'm reading something right and just emphasize something as I think of it. Okay. Well, I think it's a simple enough slide that I can even describe it. You're turning it back off. Oh. All right. I'll go for it. So, Elise, let me just check. Should I hold this? So this is. There we go. Is this working? Great. These are millions of dollars, right, on this axis. And according to this is just a subset of communities that they sampled. This bar is total net gains to the state. This is total net gains to municipalities that were positive. And this is negative net losses in this case to towns that were negative. So the net revenue for the region or the state, just in this sample, is whatever this is, $27 million, and the net negative is 2.7 million or something, right? So this is massively net positive. 27 million compared to a negative 2.7 million. Now I think, again, if I'm reading Elise's research right, this is a real challenge for the small number of communities where these costs might have increased. but it's totally swamped by the positives. So I just think this is a really important graph for this conversation. Take this down if we want now, I guess, or either way, leave it up, yeah. And one thing this highlights, and Elise talked about this, but I'll emphasize this also, is there is a challenge, again, on the margin for some of these communities around the fragmentation of governance. And it's really important to make sure that the state has the right programs in place to help offset the small number of losers to make sure that we can all, on net, be winners from new housing production. I think this graph to me suggests it's not that hard to do, and Elise mentioned many of the state programs that already exist that try to do this. What other research-based points? This is zooming out to some of the national research on these dynamics. One distinction people often neglect to make is between multifamily housing construction and single-family housing construction. Multifamily is really, really usually net positive. The environmental reasons alone might make it net positive in a different dimension, but just on the economics, the research is clear that the multifamily is where you get the biggest gains. Why is that? They often tend to have smaller households living in them. So the net revenue on the positive side might be a little bit lower if the property taxes you're generating from an apartment might be lower than from a large single-family home. But there's national research that suggests, looking nationwide, that on average, the per capita costs of households living in multifamily housing are lower than the per capita costs of families living in single-family housing. So that to me just speaks to the importance of pushing the new housing development that we're having into dense, multifamily, TOD-style housing. I don't think the MBTA communities law is perfect by any means, but it's absolutely directionally the type of approach that's trying to direct housing in that way. And I think that type of housing development, rather than sprawling single-family subdivision development, is the type that's most likely to be net fiscally positive. Let me just end with the sort of values-based and ethical case. I was talking about this upcoming event to a colleague who does housing work, also doesn't live in Newton, trying to get his thoughts and advice for how to enter the conversation. And he advised against what I've already done, which is, he said, don't talk about the research or economics at all. What's going to matter to people is the values and getting people to settle into the frame around the types of communities they want to live in. So it made me think, what's the type of community I would like to live in, or I have chosen to live in? It's a place with diversity of all sorts, diversity of age, diversity of race, diversity of occupation. And we're seeing across the region, in my sense, I don't know Newton super well, but from my, the conversations we had leading up to this, that one of the concerns around Newton is that this is a community that's losing its diversity in terms of age in particular. There's a hollowing out of families with kids. That's certainly the case statewide. We've done some research on migration trends. The fastest group that's leaving Massachusetts to other parts of the country is 25 to 35-year-olds. We're seeing a rapid exodus of those young families, and it seems clear that a large factor there is the cost of living concern. I also think if we want to be a truly liberal, welcoming region, I think those are core values to most people who live in Greater Boston. What better way to be welcoming than to literally allow people to live in your community, to build homes so that more people can live there? I can't think of a better way to truly live up to the value of being welcoming than by building more housing. Let me just end with a quote that this colleague friend sent me. I think it's provocative and builds on this. I think it's completely unreasonable to expect new housing units to pay for themselves in every circumstance. It just doesn't matter. My 3 kids went to public school at a cost far greater than what we were paying in property taxes on our single-family home. In the 10 years since our youngest kid graduated from high school, and in the 7 years we were homeowners before they were school-aged, we paid far more in property taxes than we received in public services. For every new unit occupied by school-aged kids, there's a taxpayer like me who's now making up the difference. That's just how the social contract works. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. We have a broader responsibility to a broader sphere of neighbors, to the next generation. And I think when you get your head in that space, supporting smart multifamily housing development feels like all the more of a slam dunk. Okay, that's my response to Elise. What's the best way to take the conversation? What's that? You'll start with her? Or yeah. Let me scan the questions I had ahead of time and see. Well, this may be tough, so putting you on the spot, but I'm curious, Elise, the research you've done was so statewide. In the digging you did on Newton in particular in prepping for this, is just any interesting insights you want to share about how you'd compare Newton to other communities, or do the differences not feel that great and the similarities are far greater?
So I did check, Newton was not in our sample. That said, the closer we are to Boston, the more market rate housing is financially feasible. And so that does make an impact on the kind of economic impact both for the state and for your local businesses.
Can you take that one more degree more explicit, meaning it's more likely to be net positive? Or not necessarily?
So special education students, they don't discriminate by income or race or what have you. But in terms of the income effects, so spending in your local community, those market rate units are definitely have an impact, which is why at MassINC we advocated to pass HDIP so that way it's financially feasible to build market rate in our gateway cities.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sorry, could you just clarify that one step further? The closer you get to the Boston area, again, that is more feasible.
Yep.
To market rate. Are you saying that therefore, on balance, market rate becomes a greater percentage of the distribution classification?
Yeah, I live in New Bedford. Like almost every single new housing unit that gets built is income restricted because that's the only kind that pencils out in terms of the financials.
This is skipping in a totally different direction, but there's one point I forgot to raise, and I think is relevant here. So in prior work, this is 7+ years ago, I worked as an education analyst at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We did a lot of research around the state's Chapter 70 funding formula. I'm not nearly as expert now as I was then about exactly the particulars of the formula. I know there have been some important changes with the Student Opportunity Act a few years ago. But I did look at the formula spreadsheet for Newton Public Schools in prep for this. And I think there's a couple schools folks in the audience, so please chime in if this feels wrong. But there are some communities where, because of quirks of the Chapter 70 formula, even if your enrollment goes up, you might not get any more Chapter 70 aid. And those are communities who have been getting a good deal, frankly, by Chapter 70. So any more bump just doesn't trigger any more Chapter 70 aid. I'm pretty certain that is not the case for Newton. Newton is what's called a foundation aid district, which means for every additional student you might enroll, if you have a net increase, you're going to get a significant portion of the associated costs with that extra student reimbursed through additional Chapter 70 aid. So I think in the Newton context, in near-term years, net new students would absolutely generate significant new Chapter 70 aid. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm sorry, I'm Emily Carter, I'm on the school committee.
All right, this is where I'm stepping in.
Yes, that is true. We will get additional funding, but we are a minimum aid community. So the amount of additional funding that we get, and we currently spend based on our tax base and our priorities as a government, well beyond the foundation formula for what we're required to do. So yes and no.
Can I just to...
Sure.
My understanding, and again, I'm careful because I could be wrong, but was even though absolutely right that Newton spends well above its required minimum contribution, that because you're a foundation aid district, net new students in a future year would also just bump you more Chapter 70.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with that, but compared to the bump in the amount of money that other districts get, we get a very small additional bump. It's not like any of the gateway cities who definitely need the additional funding. I'm not begrudging them in any way, shape, or form. I'm that because we spend beyond our chapter, the foundation formula, if there's an increase in chapter 70 funding, or even, in all fairness to the mayors in the past, and it's not just for current mayors, this has been true for years. If we go down, the budget doesn't get cut, and our budget doesn't go up. We get a specific allocation from the mayor every year, and does it help when we get additional chapter 70 funding? Yes. But it's not a huge, like, we are not waiting with bated breath to find out what our additional chapter 70 funding is going to be.
Yep.
People who are on Zoom, and there's a lot of folks on Zoom
Oh, they
as
can't
well.
hear.
They can't hear.
Questions.
So
You gotta
maybe
do
if
it.
you could slide over to that
Yeah.
mic,
Or-
and Luke can.
So we'll share this and then, okay.
Or there's something else to say.
You're good?
Oh, okay.
Unless they
All-
just got an additional question. Sorry.
I was wondering if we should talk about the scale of housing. 'Cause I know there was like some.
Yeah, go for it.
I was thinking we should talk about the scale of housing. I know there was some fear mongering around giant housing developments being built. And our current financial system for developing new housing definitely incentivizes that kind of housing development, which is why you see a lot of it. But it is by far not the only kind of housing that can be built, especially in a place like Newton, where you have the financials for the market to build its own housing without subsidy. And so I don't know if you heard about Oregon, where they basically just banned single-family housing, single-family zoning. Some people, I say that, and some people think, what, you're going to tear down my house and put up a duplex? I'm like, no, it just means you're allowed to. It doesn't mean you have to. But, I mean, duplexes, triplexes, there are ways to add a little bit more housing in a way that kind of blends in with your community and not adding a ton more traffic without going to that 200-unit housing development. But we do need additional state tools to make that happen. I could go on about that, but I think in a place like Newton, it could probably happen naturally.
Want to go to more back and forth?
Maybe you have one more? Then
Yeah.
we can-
I think, no, I don't love any of these ones I've got left. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so we'll go to kind of open Q&A now. We'll start here, and then we'll bop back and forth to Josh, who's going to be piping them in from the Zoom.
I'm curious, with the drop in school-age population, are there any outcomes that are continuing that trend negative because we lose the students? For example, we lose enough students, now we start closing elementary schools because we don't have the population. Now kids have to travel further to go to the closest elementary school. Are there any things that we can learn from, like, we need to just add housing to keep the school-age population constant to keep the benefits that we have now? And not just from you guys, but anyone.
You might
in the
also want
audience.
to talk about the working age population that you showed in your data on migration.
Okay.
Go for it.
So one thing I didn't say before that I want to be very clear is that I am 150%. I didn't want there to be a whiff that I am not supportive of having additional housing for, as we are all called, Newton for everyone. So please know that. I just was talking about the financing of the Chapter 70 and state funding. And yes, circuit breaker is critical for us. So thank you for putting that on the slide. I just wanted to say that we're in the process right now, it'll be happening in the next school committee meeting and the school committee meeting after that, to discuss neighborhood schools and sort of the future of neighborhood schools. And I don't think that we have anything to worry about anytime in the near future about that. So I hope that hears.
This is jumping off of Newton to Boston, but that's a huge issue in the city of Boston. We did a big report a couple of years ago comparing the demographic composition of who lives in Boston with the school population in BPS. And Boston serves as a real cautionary tale of the extreme. BPS, back in 1950, had something like 110, 120,000 students enrolled. Today, well below half that. I think they're right around 50,000 students today. So there's a huge, important, tough conversation they're having around the number of school buildings they're continuing to operate with a much smaller number of kids. And as those schools are deteriorating, politically, it's so difficult to merge schools, and it gets into some of the real challenges around proximity and neighborhoods. So I don't think there's any reason to think Newton's towards that, but it's happening in other places.
We have a bunch of questions from people on the Zoom. The first one has to do with apartment buildings. They noticed a lot of apartment buildings are going up in Newton and in surrounding communities, and they asked if there is a way to know what the percentage occupancy is for these buildings. They're curious, are these buildings actually being filled? Is there demand for market rate housing or just for affordable housing?
I'll just say quickly, my sense sort of region-wide is there is not a big issue with a lot of vacancies in our apartments. In terms of across the whole market, a report we do every year for the Boston Foundation, where our research center is embedded, is the Greater Boston Housing Report Card. In Metro Boston, this isn't specific to Newton, but Metro Boston now has the very lowest rental vacancy rates of any competitor metro area in the whole country. And very similar, I think we're third lowest of the largest metro areas in terms of home ownership vacancy rates. So, on the margin in some of the super luxury high towers in downtown Boston, some of those might be being used as an investment property, but my sense is region-wide, that's really not the issue at all. And in fact, the problem is the reverse, that there's no vacancies at all, and anybody looking to rent a new apartment is having a lot of trouble finding one.
We'll go one here in the room, kind of bounce back and forth. Anybody?
This guy's been waiting.
It seems to be that condos and home-owned property development is on the downside, that developers are pretty much building apartments only. And I've heard because financing is hard for home ownership properties. So when we're looking at another issue, which is equity and economic equity, one of the only ways you can develop that is home ownership. So what's going to happen when we have lots of new apartments and people have no home ownership?
I'll take this. That's a problem that's pretty well recognized, starting to be recognized at this point, that our approach to solving the housing crisis and the affordable housing crisis has been largely apartments. We do need them. There is that said, like you said, homeownership is the path to wealth building. It's also a form of affordable homeownership, because once your mortgage doesn't go up on you randomly because someone decided to raise the price on your house, you're pretty much locked in over time, right? And so it's a form of affordable homeownership, a form of affordable living in that sense. Luckily, we're starting to wade into that water. There's a new program called Commonwealth Builder run by Mass Housing for affordable home ownership. And there are condos being built throughout the state through that program. But it's only a first step, but something that we hopefully will see more of.
So this next question is definitely wonky, and hopefully I'll get it right. The person wrote in, I've encountered a lot of opposition to building housing, especially multifamily housing, based on the perceived negative fiscal impacts of new construction via the effect on Chapter 70 state aid formulas to localities. Essentially, the argument is that newly built housing will tend to be occupied by those with higher than average incomes than the city or town as a whole, and thus will increase the Chapter 70 local contribution requirements for municipalities while eroding what they receive in Chapter 70 state aid relative to their needs. Are you with me?
I don't think I got
Okay.
that to do all that.
This phenomenon is less relevant in places like Newton that are wealthy enough to have hit the 175% combined effort yield, after which their minimum required local contribution is always 82.5% of assessed needs. Rather, it mostly affects small urban enclaves like Lynn, Salem, Haverhill, and Malden. And the question is there any research out there that verifies this phenomenon and quantifies when Chapter 70 makes growth and development prohibitive for cash-strapped municipalities and when it doesn't? And maybe you can explain the question to me.
Yeah. I'll share some reactions that are hopefully directionally helpful, but probably won't definitively answer. I don't think the research that the person's asking for at the end, I haven't seen that. A quick 101 on Chapter 70, which might be helpful here, is this is way stripped down simplification of how it works, but the basic contours are accurate, and I think it's helpful to structure it. So what the state does as the first step in the formula is calculate an estimate of what it would cost to provide a decent baseline education given a bunch of assumptions, and that's called the foundation budget. So your foundation budget is calculated here, and then the next two steps are to see how much of that should reasonably come from local tax revenue, which is the local contribution that question's talking about. And then, so if this is foundation budget, and the estimate of what the town can reasonably contribute given property values, you have to fill the gap with Chapter 70 state aid to make sure every community can get to that minimum foundation budget amount. So what this question's saying is, if the community gets wealthier, the calculation for their required contribution goes up, and they might get less Chapter 70 from that calculation. So I think like conceptually that's accurate. Obviously, I think it's doing that for a good reason, which is you're getting wealthier so you can contribute more, and more of those state resources that are needed for the lower income communities can go out in Chapter 70 to the others.
Isn't there a hold harmless policy?
Yeah, there's a bunch of reasons why this is oversimplified. And hold harmless is one, meaning communities don't actually get a cut in their Chapter 70 from one year to the next, even if they wouldn't need it in the same sense. The other thing on Newton, though, is, I think this speaks to your point, Newton consistently gives way above that required minimum contribution. So this is why I think in the question they nod to the fact this isn't so relevant for Newton, because even if the formula said you needed to contribute more, the amount more that you're already doing would almost certainly swamp that change in the next year.
Maybe you'll have an easier question. We'll find out.
Yes, that's my intention, to have a much, much simpler question. And this is about the real estate tax impact to a town or city. How do you compare, let's say hypothetically, a 20-unit apartment building, rental, versus a 20-unit condo, in other words, where the apartments are sold? Which one would be more beneficial from a real estate tax point of view? What's more valuable on the market?
I think they would be assessed at the same value and wouldn't lead to a different property tax assessment.
It's more about the value of the actual land and the materials built upon it than anything else.
Now on the cost side, I would suspect on the cost side, who's living in those units may likely be different. I think you might be likely to get fewer families, for instance, in the rental units than the home ownership units. That's more speculation than certainty, but.
I'm not sure you've got data on that.
Yeah.
You think that might be wrong?
Were there
Yeah.
some housing people here who were thinking of that?
Maybe not. So yeah, withdrawn, yeah.
The quality of construction that goes into condos is higher, there are more amenities, more luxury, common areas, all kinds of things that do not go into rental.
Yeah. Well, she was saying that.
On the first part, on the property tax assessment.
Yeah, she's saying the condos might be built to a higher level than the apartments. I mean, that wasn't really in the question. It was assuming the same building, just different ownership structures. But assuming that, yeah. If it was built higher quality, it would be taxed higher.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to do the analysis, and it can be easily done. Let's say those are $1.5 million condos, times 20, do the numbers. And then you have to look at the assessment as an apartment building. And it's not based on cost. It has nothing to do with cost. It has to do with the market value, which the assessment will be relative to. So you really have to run those numbers, and it's a good question. It's something, I could do or other people could do.
Yeah.
But do you think what's behind your comment is do you have a hunch which way it would go in Newton, say? Or you mean it purely in the abstract, it just could go either way?
It could go either way. My hunch would be it would probably be worth a little bit more as a condo, because if you look at where the prices have gone, the average home in Newton has gone from $900,000 to $1.7 million in the past 10, 12 years. I don't know where, the rents have gone up, but I don't know how the apartment building values have gone. So really, it's a great question, and somebody should do those numbers.
So I was looking into the 20-year inflation rates on rentals in Newton versus housing costs, like owner-owned units in Newton. And I think it was around like an 84% increase in rental unit costs versus like 122% housing home ownership costs over 20 years. Yes. Yeah.
Was that the selling price or the assessed value?
I think it was selling price.
So just to clarify, the taxes would be based on the assessed value, not the selling price.
We have a question about schools. One person wrote in to say that the Newton schools or high schools are over capacity. North, they said, has 50% more kids than it was the physical capacity was designed for. And they say at South, kids are sitting on radiators. And they're curious about how the economic model works if the schools physically need more space for the children that are added through the development.
I mean, we do have a program for that through the Massachusetts School Building Authority. We're undertaking a research project on things that are going wrong with the Massachusetts School Building Authority. So I'm going to postpone answering that question until we do that research. But
Okay, we'll go to another question. Sounds like, or did you want to comment on that?
I don't have to, it's really, I just want to.
that's not right.
Let's answer that. Yeah.
It's not, 50, I don't think 50% is an accurate statement, that it's 50% oversubscribed.
15.
15. I would say that it would probably be closer. I don't have the exact number of how many seats that we have available versus not. I know that there are certain classes that are highly oversubscribed. There are significant issues with the physical plant at Newton South, which is something that I've been working hard, that and Brown Middle School, to be next in the queue. But yes, there's definitely some capacity issues, particularly in certain classes.
Hi, I wanted to change the focus just a little bit to maybe some of the values-based issues. And I'm curious as to whether there have been any studies as to the impact of increased housing on increasing the racial and ethnic diversity in communities. Because I think that is another aspect of what we care about in our community, and I'd really be interested in hearing something on that.
Research that we've been directly involved in that's kind of in the reverse, which actually I mentioned Amy Dane earlier. We worked with her and she really led this research on a project called Exclusionary by Design that we released last fall. Folks should Google it and check it out if you haven't. And it's the really deepest historical investigation anyone's done for Massachusetts into the historic inception of local zoning codes across it's greater Boston suburbs since zoning started getting adopted about 100 years ago. And what she uncovered, I think not surprisingly, but it's really tough to see the evidence right in front of you, is many suburbs adopted exclusionary zoning rules we're using that term intentionally because zoning, if you think, the zoning is putting on paper what is prohibited from existing in your community. And suburbs across Greater Boston and across the country used zoning as a tool for excluding undesirable groups. And there's no surprise then why we have such patterns of residential segregation across the region. Certainly it's been used as a tool for racial segregation, but also class-based. One of the things Amy found a lot of was evidence from local town meeting discussions, from master plans generations ago, where they're very explicitly trying to sort of generate a community that doesn't have undesirable communities. A wave of exclusion of triple deckers when they were perceived as immigrant housing that was undesirable in Boston suburbs. So that's not so much about the sort of forward-looking about how helpful it would be to undo that, but I think it stands to reason that the more we can undo that, the greater opportunity we have for residential integration.
And there's been a lot of research some very, very good research on how more integrated schools improve academic outcomes way more than just spending money in those school districts ever could.
We have another math question, which I like. Okay. Since only about 20% of Newton residences today send their children to the public schools, and the schools account for 65% of the budget.
Wait, what's this?
Okay, I'm reading the question. I'll read it more slowly. Since the person asked, since only 20% of Newton residences send their children to our public schools, and the schools account for 65% of the budget, if substantially more than 20% of the new housing sends children to the school, would that net fiscal impact still be positive?
I was just looking at that data today. I saw the bar was like this big and the private school was like that, so I think you might have it opposite, like 20% to private and 80 to public. No?
This is just, I think they're talking about all families.
All families. A lot.
I was on the school committee, so it's 29 years ago, and that's the number that's been constant. 20% of the population in Newton sends their kids to schools. The rest of them, their kids are out of school, and they still live here.
Okay.
So that's not a change.
So at a percent of all households, regardless of whether they have kids or not.
Right.
Got it.
But the question there was then, if we have this consistent 20% rate, if the population that was to live in new housing looked different from the current population, would that change anything about your analysis of the fiscal impact?
Can I guess for you? Like, my guess is that if the new families were somehow dramatically different composition and many, many more of them had kids, that probably would change some of this math. But again, just looking at this graph, there's still massive gains to offset those potential increases.
Yeah.
And again, come back to the values. Do we want to, have more families with kids or not? Maybe that's just something we want to have.
But, I mean, we didn't look at Newton specifically, so I can't say that this would change for Newton specifically, because we didn't even look at Newton specifically. That said, all of the students that we looked at were in public schools. So this data already has those kids going to public schools. So if anything, it would just be more of the same, as opposed to being more different, because Newton is somewhat different in this regard.
Yeah. I just wanted to speak a little bit to the types of units that are getting built. I mean, often we're pushing to have some 3-bedroom units so that there'll be some family housing, but most of the new units that are getting built are studio, single, and two-bedroom. And so there's less likely to have kids. And it's been shown in the Boston area that that buildings that are multifamily, the average number of kids there is less than when it's in a single family. And also in Newton, another aspect is that the people that are moving into those units are people who want to stay in Newton and are downsizing. And so there's a lot of, like a trio, there's a lot of elderly people have moved there, and so no longer have kids. So that's also, so it's not I think if anything, it's shifting towards fewer kids.
Okay, we'll do one more in the room and then one more from the Zoom.
Yeah, I just want to thank you both for this presentation. It's really good data, and as a fellow data nerd, it's very, you kind of had me at hello. I did want to come to the values piece of it, because I think in the end, the cynic might say that all of this just really is completely irrelevant. I mean, you touched upon it when you talked about people's conceptions, priors, whatever it might be, their values. And so I'm curious just what you would say to people who are a little frustrated about where, if you want to move in this direction, you want to encourage people to be more aware of this. I don't believe that presenting more data is going to be helpful. I don't think that's how Newton's discourse plays out. And so I'm just curious. I mean, it's an unfair question. It doesn't have to be some magic wand, but I know some people have sort of tried to zero in on intersectional issues or just sort of find some touchstone things and kind of make that the focal point rather than the broader discussion of housing. But I on the one hand, love what you're saying, and on the other hand, feel a little dissatisfied because I have zero confidence that any of this could ever directly impact, for or against, by the way, could ever directly impact in a rational way a debate about this, at least in Newton.
I can start.
So
I think you can't build what you can't visualize, and we don't have that many examples of small infill development that blends in naturally with the existing community structure, that has a good mix of incomes as opposed to like all market rate or all income restricted. And I think to get there, we need slightly different tools, but I think the state is working on them, partially through the Affordable Homes Act. I think there could be some more tweaks to encourage small-scale development. One area that gives me hope is a focus on developing developers of color, because I think focusing on emerging developers, you also need to think about what providing opportunities and like housing development opportunities that are more scaled for like someone who's new to the industry, right? And so I'm a big believer in incrementalism to get comfortable with something. You don't want to go from 0 to 60. You want to kind of test the waters a little bit, and having those small housing developments allow you to try things out. And I think right now the best way to get there is at the state level is through initiatives to encourage emerging developers.
My response is not a direct, here's the best message, but to just share some optimism from my vantage point, which is, I think for a long time, these local debates around housing development in people's neighborhoods have been almost entirely dominated by people who don't want it to happen. And something just very natural about that. You get a notice at your doorstep around a neighborhood meeting on something proposed across the street, and you're worried about the construction, the parking, and the people who are most angry are the ones who are going to be most likely to show up. And that's what we've seen for a long time. And there's a lot of research at Boston University. Katie Einstein has done really important national research on how unrepresentative people who are participating in these processes are. And I think it's been remarkable how much that's changing really quickly in our region. And groups like Newton for Everyone, Engine 6. I mean, just the fact that Newton has two all volunteer-led pro-housing groups, I think is remarkable. And there's the organizing around MBTA communities across the region, 177 communities adopting or debating at least adopting multifamily zones in their communities has led to a groundswell of organizing that is unprecedented. So just the fact of showing up is new and I think reason for optimism.
I don't know if you can, there we go. One last question. Somebody wanted to thank you for coming here this evening and for staying a little extra late, and I'll thank everybody else in the room for staying a little extra late. They were hoping you could just summarize what are the big factors that people in Newton, that citizens of Newton, residents of Newton, should be thinking about to figure out which of those bar graphs we're most likely to be on as we if we are to expand our development.
I would say incorporate a 40R district in your planning.
I'm not sure where to end. I don't know if, Luke, you want to share any thoughts on some of these. You had, not to put you on the spot, but.
I mean, I would actually, you had made the point about the values-based argument. It's a little bit of a dodge. That's not a values-based question, but like I think that's important. I think you should come back to that. I think Kathy made a good point about the composition of the units in terms of them largely being studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom. You're unlikely to see people. I come from Irish stock. You can fit a lot of kids in a two-bedroom. It is not as common today. So I think that might be a factor. I think that would push us away from school spending and more toward just the sort of natural property tax income coming in. But I am not wonky enough to be super confident in my answer there.
We actually created multipliers, I'm happy to share, that will allow you to estimate how many students are associated with a new housing development based on the bedroom mix. I think you should also make room for families, so maybe not take it too far, but it is a strategy.
We will have one of these about single-stair reform at some point. If you thought this was not nerdy enough, we will get much nerdier in the future. And speaking of time and being nerdy and going to bed early, we're going to wrap it up here. I'll see if I can switch mic, or I'll just stand right here. That's fine. But yeah, we are going to leave it there. Before we go, I want to do a big thanks to Luc and Elise. Which one of these again? There we go. Just fantastic. Thank you both so very much. If you enjoyed this event and would like to hear, a couple other people to thank. We want to thank Dennis Milligan, who has been doing all the AV stuff, and we want to thank Congregation Dorshe Tzedek for hosting us here tonight. Lastly, if you enjoyed this event and want to hear more about housing in Newton and join us in supporting that, please sign up for our newsletter. You can sign the QR code outside. You can sign up on paper outside. Both of those things work. We'll be having more events around about topics like this and also other topics like affordable housing, workforce housing for teachers and the police, and the connections between housing and the environment. Thank you all so much for coming, and good night.